This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
And now for our feature presentation.
When it comes to remaking video games, I'm usually content with a less is more approach. Honestly, you can just upscale the graphics, maybe add some quality of life improvements as needed, put them out on modern platforms, and that's generally all I need to be satisfied. The sort of from the ground up remakes like Final Fantasy VII-R or the various Resident Evil remakes, I mean, I like all those games, but at the same time, the mere fact that they exist, at least to me, sends a weird message, almost like the originals aren't good enough anymore, regardless of how true that is. Let me give a concrete example. For the past couple years, we've heard stirrings about a potential remake of Final Fantasy IX. As far as I know, this hasn't been confirmed yet, but it's a persistent rumor, and honestly, it's something I could see Square Enix doing. But really, is Final Fantasy IX a game that really needs to be remade? I mean, you can already buy it on just about every platform under the sun, which raises the more important question, is the original flawed enough to justify such a project? I mean, yeah, everyone's talked about how the battle system is kinda slow, but if you buy the most recent release, you get a turbo mode, so boom, problem mitigated. Everything else about the game, the story, the graphical style, the music, I think they're just fine as they are. The mere fact that the game is held up over 20 years later still speaks to that. So I don't think that Square should waste their time remaking it. For me, their resources would be much better spent on other games. Games that, for whatever reason, were unable to measure up to their full potential at their initial release. And that's what this video is going to be about. This is a list of 8 JRPGs that, according to that criterion, deserve to be remade. They're in no particular order, and I'm going to avoid any and all possible spoilers. Alright, enough stalling. Let's get into it. For my first choice, since I opened the video talking about Final Fantasy IX, I figured I'd nominate a more worthy candidate for a remake: Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II is the perennial loser when it comes to the franchise's 2D entries, arguably even the series as a whole, since I've probably seen it placed at the bottom of more Final Fantasy rankings than any other entry in the series. A major factor in its negative standing lies in its non-traditional progression system. Instead of using levels and experience points, as its predecessor did, characters improve individual traits by performing specific actions. For instance, a character who repeatedly uses a sword would improve both their physical attack strength as well as their proficiency with that weapon. This sounds interesting in theory, but according to most who've played it, the system fails in practice. Not only was it confusing and built upon necessary grinding, it led to some hilariously unattended consequences, the most infamous being the fact that attacking your own party members is the quickest way to raise their HP. Furthermore, I personally felt the system implicitly discouraged experimentation, since it's to your benefit to hyper-focus on specific weapons, skills, etc. to ensure that they're strong enough. This is a shame, since your characters don't have fixed classes and can therefore theoretically be customized in whichever way you please. Subsequent re-releases of the game have tweaked the progression parameters to iron out some of the wrinkles, but this has never been enough to satiate fan complaints. When the foundation is this insecure, you'd need a complete reconstruction to fix all of its problems. A remake with a more conventional progression system would, I think, win a lot of fans over, as, for its time, Final Fantasy II's story is far more powerful than it has any right to be. It's very basic, to be sure. Evil Empire tries to take over the world while a resistance force tries to stop them. But complexity is not the aspect that the story derives its power from. That, instead, is in its tone. Final Fantasy II so intensely portrays the sheer waste and futility of war in a way that the series would not approach again until the release of Final Fantasy XVI 35 years later. A remake would give the story the opportunity to shine without the weight of that progression system holding it back. And of course, Square could use the opportunity to expand that story to meet modern standards. Primarily, this should mean giving the main characters much more of a personality. Though Final Fantasy II was the first game in the series to have specific, named protagonists, personality-wise they were a little more memorable than the generic class archetypes from Final Fantasy I. This is one game where the side characters totally outshone its mains. Anyway, I've always liked Final Fantasy II, even though I totally recognize why so many people don't. That said, I don't want to see it eternally condemned to the bottom of every fan's favorite Final Fantasy list, and I sincerely believe a remake could rescue it from that fate. Hey Square, Final Fantasy IX is going to be okay, regardless of whether you remake it or not. Final Fantasy II could use your help a hell of a lot more. For my second pick, I'll stay within the Squaresoft sphere of influence and talk about a game I seem to be legally obligated to discuss in every video I make. Xenogears. I'm sure nobody's surprised to see Xenogears on this list, as it's one of the most, if not the most, requested RPG to be remade. Of course, this is primarily because of the unfortunate state of the game's second disc, which was presented primarily in the style of a visual novel due to the development team running out of time to complete it. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to call the game unfinished as others have. The story the team wanted to tell is told in its entirety, but the way in which that story is told does not do the final product any favors. Aside from the major stylistic changes, the pace of the second disc is so breakneck that it's detrimental to how the story is told. One earth-shattering event happens after another, and the player is given virtually zero time to process any of them. It's a testament to the power of Xenogears' story that, despite all those issues, most who play it regard it as one of the most profound narratives in the history of video games. Nonetheless, I don't think anybody would be opposed to a remake where the second disc could be restored to its originally intended form. And while that's obviously the biggest thing that needs to be changed, Square could use the remake to add a number of smaller improvements as well. Personally, I think Xenogears' graphical style makes it a perfect candidate for an HD 2D remake, and if games like Live Alive and Star Ocean: The Second Story can find success with the form, an HD 2D Xenogears would probably blow those games out of the water. Additionally, what about an easier-to-understand progression system for death blows, or retooled platforming for areas like the Tower of Babel? Clearly, there's a lot of potential here. There's just one important caveat I need to add. I don't want to see a remake of Xenogears if Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaori Tanaka aren't directly involved. Xenogears is their story, and not only do they deserve the opportunity to tell it in a way that they've always wanted, I don't think any other creative team could do it justice without them. Since we're talking about Takahashi and Tanaka, for my third pick, I'm going to choose one of their more obscure works, Soma Bringer. So, full disclosure, a while ago I made an entire video where I reviewed Soma Bringer, so if you're interested in hearing me talk about it in more depth, there's a link. But here's the short version. Soma Bringer is the game Takahashi made between Xenogears Episode 3 and the first Xenoblade. It's a fun, accessible action RPG with a charming graphical style, a great Yasunori Mitsuda soundtrack, and phenomenally detailed world building, considering that it's a short game released for the Nintendo DS. Now, one of the primary reasons I'd like to see this game remade is purely due to issues of accessibility. Soma Bringer was only ever released on the DS in Japan, and has never been re-released since. A worldwide release on the Switch could do wonders for its profile, and this would give Monolith Soft the excuse to upgrade the visuals, as the DS's tiny screen was nowhere near powerful enough to do justice to Soma Bringer's graphics. But more than anything, I'd like to see a remake of Soma Bringer where the story was retooled to have one, and only one, main character. See, Soma Bringer is a game with a ton of customization options, and one of those options is that you're given the choice of one of 8 characters to play the game as. There's an unintended negative consequence to this, though. Because the game has to be designed around the player choosing any of those 8 characters, Soma Bringer doesn't really feel like it has an actual protagonist. It's like Final Fantasy II in that sense. The side characters are far more memorable. Of the 8, it feels like Velt is the most obvious candidate to be the protagonist, so if the game were remade, I'd want the story's emphasis retooled to reflect that. Have the other main characters secure in their positions as the supporting cast, and I think this would make the story much more memorable. Anyway, I love Xenoblade, but the last thing I want is for Monolith Soft to do nothing but make Xenoblade games until the end of time. What better way to ease their way into diversifying their portfolio than to remake Soma Bringer? Alright, I'm going to cheat one more time for this next one and talk about another game, or should I say series of games, that I've made a full video about in the past, the Legend of Heroes Gagarv trilogy. Like Soma Bringer, a big reason why I want to see these games remade is due to accessibility. Here in the English-speaking world, the only release of the Gagarv trilogy was on the PSP, and, to be blunt, those ports were not good. The battle system was generic, the translation sounded like something out of the early 90s, the environments were ugly, even the rearranged music was bizarrely dull, which for a Falcom game is a cardinal sin. When I made my video, I planned on looking at the trilogy as a whole, but I ended up abandoning it partway through a tier of Vermilion because those ports just wore me down. As selfish as it is, I'd appreciate a remake because I'd like to play the series and actually enjoy myself while playing it. And I think this would benefit the Japanese as well. From what I understand, there are a ton of different ports of these games, most of them pretty significantly different from one another. The trilogy could seriously benefit from having some sort of definitive versions, kind of like what Falcom did with the early Ys games. Honestly, Falcom could re-release the trilogy and just use the same engine they did for the Sky trilogy, and I'd be perfectly fine with that. This would make the trilogy a million times more palatable, in my opinion, but while they're there, perhaps they could also fix a couple of the series' other issues. Don't get me wrong, as far as the plot and characters are concerned, the Gagarv games are wonderful, as per usual for Falcom. That being said, as their first serious attempt at creating this sort of deep, extended narrative, the series has a few kinks. The games are painfully linear. Some of the dungeons are literal straight hallways with very few actual enemies, and some scenes, while entertaining, go on for perhaps far longer than they need to, almost as if Falcom was so intoxicated by their newfound narrative freedom that they didn't think about how those scenes were to be paced. But these are easy enough to work out, especially if they use the writing team they've got working on the Trails games. Speaking of which, much like how I wouldn't want Xenoblade to condemn games like Somabringer to obscurity, I don't want Trails to condemn the Gagarv trilogy to obscurity. They're wonderful stories on their own. Alright, that's enough of games I've already made videos on. How about we move on to something that I've never talked about before? Ogre Battle, The March of the Black Queen. This is an important game in a number of different respects. It's the first entry in the legendary Ogre Battle series of strategy RPGs, and was the big break for the game's writer-director, Yasumi Matsuno, who would later go on to create Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and of course, Tactics Ogre. In fact, anyone watching this who's a fan of Tactics Ogre owes it to themselves to check out Ogre Battle, as several of its characters show up in that game too. So why does Ogre Battle need to be remade? Again, part of it is an accessibility thing. Save for a couple ports to the Saturn and PlayStation in the mid-90s, the game has never been re-released. And no, I'm not counting the Japanese flip phone ports from the early 2010s, because why the hell would I? This is in stark contrast to Tactics Ogre, which has continually gotten re-releases for decades and is currently accessible on basically every modern platform. Aside from that, there are a number of aspects of Ogre Battle that, to me at least, are well past due for an upgrade. First, the world map is ugly. I'm sorry, it just is. The character models and battles are nice, but the environments aren't. The problem is, since this is a strategy RPG, most of your time is going to be spent looking at that world map. In addition, I think the combat system needs an improvement as well. Ogre Battle has a rather unique combat system. Basically, it's a cross between a traditional strategy game and an RTS. You move your units in real time and run into enemy units who also move in real time to start battle. The problem is, once you start battle, you don't actually have any control over your characters. The battles play out automatically. The most control you have, if you can even call it that, is the ability to customize your units, but I get that that doesn't really count. If the game were to be remade, you'd need to have more control in battle, because again, this is a strategy RPG, a lot of what you're going to be doing is battling enemies. Hell, even if giving more control to your units means retooling the battle system to something more conventional, like something out of, say, Fire Emblem or Super Robot Wars, so be it. I don't think most fans would care. I'd rather have something a bit more conventional if that means actually being able to enjoy the story, because, for me, as time went on, it became much harder and harder to actually do that. And that's a shame, because Matsuno is one of the most brilliant writers in the history of video games. Anyone who's played any of his more popular titles can vouch for that. March of the Black Queen deserves a bigger audience. If Matsuno himself isn't going to make any more games and just stick to writing the occasional scenario for Final Fantasy XIV, the least we can do is make sure that his back catalog is available in a definitive form. My sixth choice is the third entry in a franchise that's gotten a lot of renewed attention as of late. Star Ocean Till the End of Time. So, believe it or not, I actually like Till the End of Time more than either of the first two Star Ocean games. I realize this is a hot take. I mean, Star Ocean 2 especially is considered one of the all-time greats of the PlayStation generation, and its HD 2D remake did nothing to sully that legacy. I don't know though, everything about Till the End of Time just clicked with me more than those other two games. The setting, the story, the characters, the combat, the crafting and customization systems, literally everything. So if that's the case, you may be asking, why is it that I want this game to be remade? Well, anyone who's played it already knows where I'm going with this, but my reason is essentially singular, and it all has to do with the story. I promised I wouldn't go into spoilers in this video, so I'll be brief. There's a major plot twist that happens in the game's back half, and to put it bluntly, it was not well received. Fans thought it was stupid, and it feels like the developers, Tri-Ace, agree with them. The subsequent Star Ocean games seem to go out of their way to pretend that plot twist never happened. Thankfully, they aren't so ashamed as to make the game unavailable. You can still buy it digitally on PSN right now, for instance, but that almost doesn't matter. Till the End of Time's reputation is such that the plot twist is the dominant thing the game is remembered for, and I don't think it's entirely fair. Like I said, as far as gameplay and story is concerned, I actually like it better than a lot of the other entries in the series. If Tri-Ace remade the game with a reworked story, kinda like what Falcom does with their canonical remakes of the early Ys games, I think that would be fine. Hell, I don't even think that would be that difficult to do. It's not like the rest of the story would suddenly fall apart if that plot twist were written out. Star Ocean Till the End of Time, despite how stupid of a decision that plot twist was a leap forward for the series at large, and it would be unfair for that plot twist to be its only legacy. And since I mentioned the canonical remakes of the Ys games, I figure the next game on the list should be Ys 5, Kefin, The Lost Kingdom of Sand. If Xenogears is arguably the most requested RPG to be remade, then Ys 5 comes in at a close second. It's the only classic Ys game that has, as of this writing, not received the remake treatment, and it badly needs it. Admittedly, I did enjoy Ys 5 the one time I played it, but man, does it feel like the odd man out in comparison to the rest of the series. The game looks more like Final Fantasy than Ys. The combat is weirdly slow and clunky, not to mention laughably easy. It's got a magic system that's essentially useless, and its soundtrack is largely forgettable, something I thought I'd never say about an Ys game. The story and setting, though, I have no issues with. Ys may not have the same acclaim as the Trails series in those areas, but I've always found the games well written for what they are. Although even there, I would still want Falcom to retool the story because, as it turns out, the final scenario as seen in-game was severely cut back from the developer's original intentions. There's actually an in-depth article on the Ys wiki outlining that original scenario, which I'll link to in the description in case you want to read it. Needless to say, there's a lot of original material that Falcom could choose to include if they went ahead and remade it. Fortunately for us, of all the games on this list, Ys 5 is probably the one that's most likely to actually get a remake in the near future. The rest of the classic Ys games have all followed the same path, and Falcom president Toshihiro Kondo has specifically mentioned in interviews that he'd like to make an Ys 5 remake happen. Fans have speculated that we'll probably hear an announcement sooner rather than later, and that Falcom will develop it using a modified version of the new gameplay engine they developed for Ys 10, which sounds like the perfect scenario to me. For my final entry, I'm going to include yet another complete series, the first 4 Dot Hack games, better known to fans as Dot Hack IMOQ. So here's my history with Dot Hack. I was really interested in the series when it was first announced, so I bought the first game, Infection, when it originally released in the States in 2004. I got maybe about halfway through the game and then gave up because I thought it was too difficult. I only picked it up again, along with the rest of the series, very recently after discovering that my laptop could actually emulate PS2 games pretty well, and oh boy, to say that Dot Hack IMOQ has not aged well is an understatement. I know a fair bit of you guys are nostalgic for this series, but oh my god, was it a chore to get through. First off, the world, that's the MMORPG the game is set in, is painfully generic. I mean, hell, it's literally just called The World. Something I've noticed whenever a movie or video game or whatever tries to portray something as this crazy worldwide phenomenon is that it always fails to convince me as to why seemingly everyone on the planet would be obsessed with whatever they're describing. The world totally falls into that trap for me. It's the most bare-bones dungeon crawler in a by-the-numbers fantasy setting. And the gameplay. First of all, probably like 80% of what you do in the series is filler. Whether it's level grinding, optional side content, or farming for virus cores. But even if that wasn't the case, gameplay would still be tedious. Combat is very, very clunky, and it felt like every enemy I encountered was able to decimate my party with some sort of abnormal status effect, some of which completely wiped me out in seconds. And the fact that these games are less like a conventional series and more like one long game split up into 4 parts, after a couple games, doing the exact same things over and over again felt like such a chore that just stopped being fun. And that's a shame, because as much as I think the world is a generic setting, I think the world building, see what I did there, surrounding it is genuinely interesting. From the opening hours, I was curious to figure out what exactly was behind the mysteries of this digital realm, why all these players were falling into comas, what exactly is up with the Twilight bracelet, and why is Kite able to use it, and so on and so forth. It's a captivating setup, and that shouldn't surprise anyone, given the main writer of Dot Hack is none other than Kazunori Ito, the same man responsible for scripting the first 2 Ghost in the Shell movies, as well as the Patlabor franchise. The guy's a genuine talent as far as science fiction storytelling is concerned, but the execution of the final product just does not do that talent any favors. Admittedly, this is exactly how I feel about the few Dot Hack anime I've seen as well, which Ito also wrote, but that's a discussion for another video entirely. Anyway, like I said, Dot Hack seems to have seen somewhat of a fan resurgence in recent years, which I attribute to 2 things. Sword Art Online, which further popularized the story concept of getting stuck in an MMORPG, and the release of an HD collection of the second series of Dot Hack games, Dot Hack GU. In the wake of that collection's success, fans have been clamoring for a similar collection, if not an out-and-out remake, of IMOQ. I include myself in that group, specifically for those clamoring for an out-and-out remake, but I'm somewhat less optimistic that I'll see it made. Given the myriad issues the series has, fixing all of them would require a project on the scale of, say, Final Fantasy VII-R, and I doubt that Bandai has the desire to spend either the time or the money to bring such a project to fruition. But just because it's unlikely, doesn't mean you should write it off entirely. I mean, hell, I never thought we'd see an HD 2D remake of Live Alive, but that ended up happening. So in the words of the great sage Justin Bieber, never say never. We may end up seeing a remake of IMOQ after all, and maybe then I'll actually be able to get through the whole thing without wanting to drive a nail through my skull. So that's the end of my list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've said this before, but whenever I've done these kind of videos in the past, I always get fucking terrified of them seeming like shitty Watch Mojo caliber trash. But I think I found a style of writing them where they don't feel like that. Plus, they're just fun to make, and it's a pretty welcome break for me in between doing my normal super long deep dives or my fucking Xenogears reference guide. But before I go, question for engagement. Are there any other games you'd want to see remade? Let me know, and also let me know what it was about the original that you think qualifies it as a candidate for a good remake. Alright, I'll see you guys later.